Brothers and sisters, there is a reality that many people today would rather not think about. The spiritual life is not passive. You are either becoming more ordered toward God, or you are allowing disorder to take root in your life. We often think of spiritual protection in dramatic terms. We imagine extraordinary attacks, terrifying temptations, some obvious sign that something is spiritually wrong. But very often, the things that weaken a person's spiritual life are much quieter. They become habits, they become routines, become things we do every day without even questioning them. And because they appear ordinary, we fail to recognize how much they can affect our prayer, our self-control, our ability to resist temptation, and our relationship with God. So today I want to examine 5 everyday habits that can quietly undermine your spiritual defenses. 1. Constantly feeding your mind with noise. The first habit is never allowing your mind to become quiet. You wake up and immediately reach for your phone. You scroll while eating, consume videos while walking. You listen to something every time you are alone. And before you go to bed, you fill your mind with even more information. The problem is not that every piece of technology is evil. The problem is that a mind that is constantly occupied with noise has difficulty becoming recollected. Prayer requires attention. Examination of conscience requires attention. Discernment requires attention. And if your mind is trained to jump from one stimulation to another, every few seconds, silence can begin to feel uncomfortable. That is a warning sign. A Christian needs moments in which the mind is deliberately brought back under control. Turn off the noise. Put the phone down. Spend some time in silence. Let your mind become recollected before God. Because if you never practice silence, we may eventually discover that you cannot recognize the difference between the voice of conscience and the endless noise surrounding you too. Deliberately entertaining temptation. The second habit is more serious. Playing with things that you already know weaken you. A person may say, I know this isn't good for me, but I'll just look for a minute. Or, this entertainment isn't edifying, but everyone watches it. Or, I know this conversation is gossip, but I want to hear what happened. This is how spiritual compromise usually works. Rarely begins with someone saying, I am going to turn away from God. Instead, it begins with, just this once, I can handle it. It's not that serious. I'll stop whenever I want. Temptation becomes more dangerous when we voluntarily place ourselves near the occasions that repeatedly cause us to fall. If you know that something consistently leads you into sin, you should not be asking how close you can get to it without falling. You should be asking, why am I standing so close to it in the first place? Spiritual maturity means learning to flee unnecessary occasions of sin. You do not prove your strength by repeatedly walking into the same trap. Sometimes the most courageous spiritual decision is simply to walk away. 3. Neglecting daily prayer. The third habit is one of the most obvious, yet one of the most common. Allowing prayer to become optional. Notice how quickly we become disciplined about things we consider important. If we have an appointment, we remember it. If we have work, we show up. When someone important calls us, we answer. But when it comes to God, we sometimes say, I'll pray when I have time. And usually means we will pray only when everything else has been finished. But prayer cannot be treated as leftovers. If God receives only whatever time remains after entertainment, work, social media, errands, and distractions, then our priorities are already revealing themselves. A strong spiritual life requires consistency. You need regular prayer. You need examination of conscience. You need the sacraments. You need scripture and sound spiritual formation. And you need to persevere even when you don't feel anything. Because prayer is not primarily about getting a pleasant emotional experience. Prayer is about turning the intellect and will toward God. There will be days when prayer feels dry. Pray anyway. There will be days when you are distracted. Rest turn to prayer anyway. There will be days when you feel spiritually exhausted. Persevere anyway. Faithfulness during spiritual dryness can be far more valuable than prayer that depends entirely upon emotion. 4. Allowing small sins to become normal. Fourth habit is particularly dangerous because it gradually changes your conscience. You begin by tolerating something small, then you repeat it. Eventually, you stop being troubled by it. Finally, you defend it. That is how a disordered habit becomes part of a person's normal life. The danger is not merely the individual act. Deeper danger is what repeated sin does to the will and to one's sensitivity toward moral truth. A person who continually excuses small compromises can eventually become comfortable with much larger ones. That is why we need regular examination of conscience. Ask yourself, where am I making excuses? What temptation do I repeatedly justify? What behavior do I know I should change, but keep postponing? Where have I stopped fighting? Because I have become comfortable. When you discover something that needs to change, don't simply feel guilty about it. Make a concrete resolution, remove the occasion. Ticks God's grace. Go to confession when necessary. Begin again. The Christian life is not about pretending that we never fall. It is about refusing to remain on the ground. 5. Trying to live without dependence upon God. Fifth habit is perhaps the most fundamental: reliance. Modern culture constantly tells us that we are sufficient unto ourselves. Trust yourself, follow your feelings. Whatever makes you happy. You don't need anyone to tell you what is right. But Christianity teaches something radically different. We need God. We need His grace. We need His mercy. We need His truth. We cannot conquer every temptation through willpower alone. We cannot sanctify ourselves. We cannot manufacture holiness simply by becoming more disciplined. Grace comes first. Our response must be cooperation with that grace. This means beginning the day by turning toward God. It means asking for help before temptation comes, rather than only after we have fallen. It means cultivating humility. It means recognizing that without God, we are vulnerable, and humility is not weakness. Humility is truth. The humble person understands, I need God. Because he knows that, he seeks Him. One of the most overlooked dangers in the spiritual life is the habit of constantly filling the mind with noise. We live in a world where silence has become almost foreign. The moment a person wakes up, the phone is within reach. Before the feet even touch the floor, there are notifications, messages, headlines, videos, advertisements, opinions, and endless streams of information demanding attention. Then, throughout the day, there is rarely a moment when the mind is left alone. There is music in the car, videos during meals, social media during breaks, podcast while walking, and entertainment before going to sleep. The result is that the soul can become accustomed to perpetual stimulation. The problem is not simply that these things consume time. The deeper problem is that they train the mind to become distracted. A person who constantly feeds his senses with external stimulation gradually loses the ability to remain recollected. His attention becomes fragmented, becomes uncomfortable when there is nothing happening. Silence begins to feel empty rather than fruitful. This has consequences for prayer. Prayer requires the mind to turn toward God. It requires a certain interior stillness, a willingness to remain attentive even when there is no immediate emotional reward. But if a person has trained himself to seek stimulation every few moments. He may find 5 minutes of quiet prayer almost unbearable. The mind immediately wanders. It searches for something new. It wants another notification, another image, another sound, another piece of information. This is why silence can become an important form of spiritual discipline. Silence exposes what is actually happening inside of us. When the external noise stops, we begin to notice our thoughts, our anxieties, our attachments, our resentments, and the temptations we normally keep covered by constant distraction. Many people avoid silence precisely because they do not want to confront what is happening within them. There is also a danger in constantly consuming other people's opinions. Every moment is spent absorbing commentary, arguments, outrage, entertainment, and speculation. The mind can gradually become shaped by the world without the person even realizing it. What you repeatedly expose yourself to begins to influence how you think, what you desire, what you fear, and what you consider normal. Christian, therefore, has to become intentional about guarding the interior life. This does not mean abandoning technology or refusing all entertainment. It means learning to control them rather than allowing them to control you. There should be moments in the day when the phone is put away and the mind is permitted to become quiet. There should be time for prayer without constant interruptions. There should be moments when you are not consuming anything at all, but simply allowing yourself to be recollected before God. Spiritual life requires attention, and attention is something that must be trained. If you continually surrender your attention to every notification, every trending topic, every video, every passing distraction, you should not be surprised when you struggle to give God your undivided attention in prayer. Battle for the spiritual life often begins with something as ordinary as what you permit to occupy your mind throughout the day. The most dangerous habits in the spiritual life is deliberately placing yourself near something you already know has the power to weaken you. There's a difference between encountering temptation unexpectedly and intentionally seeking out the circumstances in which you are most likely to fall. The first may happen without your choosing. The second involves a decision. A person may know exactly what content, environment, conversation, website, relationship, or form of entertainment repeatedly leads him towards sin, and yet he continues returning to it because he believes he can control the outcome. This is where temptation becomes particularly dangerous. The person begins negotiating with himself. He says, I will only look for a moment. He says, I know where the line is. He says, I am strong enough to resist. But every time he deliberately approaches the same occasion, he is making the struggle more difficult than it needs to be. Instead of removing the opportunity for sin, he is voluntarily increasing his exposure to it. There's a practical lesson here that applies to almost every area of life. You should know your weaknesses. Every person has particular areas in which he is more vulnerable. One person may struggle with anger, another may struggle with impurity, another may struggle with gossip, pride, envy, greed, or excessive attachment to entertainment. And your weakness is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for prudence. If you know that certain circumstances repeatedly cause you to fall, wisdom requires you to take those circumstances seriously. Do not treat repeated failure as though it were simply bad luck. Examine what happens before the fall. What were you watching? Who were you talking to? Who were you talking to? What were you thinking about? Where were you? What emotional state were you in? Were you tired, angry, lonely, bored, or frustrated? Temptation often finds an open door through an ordinary weakness that has been ignored. The person who wants to grow spiritually must learn to recognize those doors before they are opened completely. This may require making uncomfortable decisions. You may need to stop following certain accounts. You may need to change what entertainment you consume. You may need to establish boundaries in particular relationships. You may need to avoid certain conversations or environments. You may need to put distance between yourself and habits that you have repeatedly justified. People resist these measures because they believe holiness means proving that they can remain near temptation without falling. But that is not prudence. If someone knows that a particular situation repeatedly causes him to sin, deliberately returning to that situation is not spiritual strength. It is presumption. There's a difference between being tempted and entertaining temptation. A thought may enter the mind without permission. A temptation may appear suddenly. The important question is, what happens afterward? Do you reject it, or do you begin developing it? Do you turn your attention elsewhere, or do you voluntarily continue thinking about it? You remove yourself from the situation, or do you remain because part of you wants to see where it leads? The spiritual battle is often won through small acts of refusal. You close the screen, leave the conversation, you change the subject, you walk away, you refuse to continue the thought. You choose something better before the temptation becomes stronger. This is where the discipline of the will begins to become concrete in ordinary daily decisions. The most serious habits that can weaken a person's spiritual life is neglecting daily prayer. Prayer is not something that should be treated as an emergency measure, something we remember only when life becomes difficult or when we need something from God. Prayer is the ordinary means by which we continually turn our minds and hearts toward Him. When prayer disappears from the daily routine, something begins to change within the person, even if that change is not immediately noticeable. The danger is that neglect usually happens gradually. A person misses prayer one morning because he is tired. The next day he becomes busy. Then there is an unexpected responsibility. Soon a week has passed and prayer has become irregular. A person may still consider himself a believer, but the daily relationship with God has been pushed further and further into the background. This is why consistency matters. A spiritual life cannot be built only upon occasional enthusiasm. There will be days when prayer feels easy and days when it feels difficult. There will be moments when a person feels deeply recollected and moments when the mind seems incapable of remaining focused. But prayer cannot depend entirely upon feelings. We pray only when we feel motivated, then we are allowing our emotions to determine our fidelity. Daily prayer requires an act of the will. You choose to set aside time for God even when you are tired. You choose to remain attentive even when distractions arise. You choose to return to prayer when your mind wanders. You choose to continue even when there seems to be no immediate emotional consolation. This kind of perseverance forms the soul because it teaches a person that God is not simply another priority competing for attention. There is also a practical dimension to prayer. A person who begins the day without turning toward God can easily move through the day relying entirely upon his own judgment. Decisions are made quickly. Temptations appear. Irritations arise. Opportunities for charity come and go. Without a habit of prayer, the person can become increasingly reactive, allowing circumstances and emotions to determine his behavior. Prayer creates a pause in which the soul remembers what ultimately matters. It brings the person back to the reality that he is accountable to God. It reminds him that his desires are not always trustworthy, that his emotions do not always tell him what is true, and that his own understanding is limited. Prayer should therefore become part of the structure of the day rather than something added when convenient. Morning prayer establishes the direction of the day. Examination of conscience helps a person recognize where he has cooperated with temptation or failed in charity. Evening prayer provides an opportunity to give thanks, ask forgiveness, consider where greater vigilance is needed. And when prayer becomes difficult, that difficulty should not automatically be interpreted as a reason to stop. Sometimes the very act of remaining faithful when prayer feels dry is what develops greater spiritual maturity. A person learns to seek God rather than merely seeking the feelings associated with devotion. A neglected prayer life also makes it easier for other habits to take control. There is no deliberate time for God. Entertainment quickly fills the space. When there is no examination of conscience, small faults remain unnoticed. When there is no recollection, distractions become normal. When there is no deliberate turning toward God, the world becomes the loudest influence on the interior life. The answer is not to wait for the perfect moment or to create an elaborate routine overnight. Begin simply, but begin consistently. Set aside a definite time. Protect it from unnecessary distractions. Approach prayer with humility rather than expecting immediate emotional consolation. When distracted, return. When tired, persevere. When you fail, begin again. The important thing is to stop treating prayer as something optional and begin treating it as a necessary part of the Christian life. One of the most subtle dangers in the spiritual life is allowing small sins and imperfections to become so familiar that we no longer recognize them as problems. Conscience does not usually become insensitive all at once. It often happens gradually through repeated compromises, repeated excuses, repeated decisions to ignore what we already know needs to change. What once troubled the conscience begins to feel ordinary. Eventually, the person can become comfortable with something that previously would have caused him to stop and reconsider. This can begin with something that appears insignificant. A person loses his temper and then excuses it because he was tired. He gossips and tells himself that he was only stating facts. He becomes dishonest in a small matter and convinces himself that it was necessary. He indulges in inappropriate entertainment and says that it is not really affecting him. He becomes increasingly attached to his phone, entertainment, money, approval, or comfort, yet continues telling himself that there is nothing seriously wrong. Danger is not merely the individual act. The deeper danger is the formation of a habit of justification. Once a person becomes accustomed to explaining away his faults, he can lose the desire to correct them. Instead of asking, how do I overcome this? He begins asking, how can I prove that this is not really a problem? It is a dangerous change in the interior life. The conscience is meant to help a person recognize moral disorder and respond to it appropriately. If a person repeatedly ignores the promptings of conscience, the ability to recognize those problems can become weaker. A person becomes accustomed to living below the standard he knows he should follow. Eventually, he may not even experience the same interior resistance that he once did. This is why regular examination of conscience is so important. A person needs moments in which he deliberately looks at his conduct and asks difficult questions. Where did I fail today? Where did I act out of pride? Where did I give in to anger? Where did I deliberately seek something I knew was not good for me? Where did I choose comfort over duty? Where did I fail to control my speech? Where did I make an excuse instead of taking responsibility? These questions are not meant to produce despair. They are meant to produce honesty. There's a great difference between humility and self-condemnation. Humility says, I have a weakness here, and I need God's grace to overcome it. Pride says, I have no problem. Despair says, I am hopeless and cannot change. Neither pride nor despair leads to genuine conversion. The proper response is repentance combined with confidence in God's mercy. Small compromises should therefore be taken seriously before they become established habits. If you notice yourself repeatedly falling into the same fault, do not simply shrug your shoulders and say, it's just how I am. A repeated fault is precisely the kind of thing that deserves attention. Ask what causes it. Identify the circumstances. Make a concrete resolution. Seek accountability when appropriate. Remove unnecessary occasions that encourage the behavior. The spiritual life requires vigilance because habits are formed through repetition. Every time you choose virtue, you strengthen the disposition toward virtue. Every time you deliberately indulge a disordered habit, you make that habit easier to repeat. This is why seemingly small decisions can have consequences far beyond the moment in which they occur. The goal is not to become obsessed with every minor imperfection. The goal is to remain spiritually awake. Do not allow yourself to become so accustomed to a fault that you stop caring about it. Do not let repeated compromise become your definition of normal. When you recognize something that needs correction, bring it honestly before God and take the next faithful step toward changing it. A person who remains attentive to the small things is less likely to be overwhelmed when greater trials arrive. He learns to recognize the first movements of temptation, the first signs of pride, first rationalizations, and the first compromises before they become deeply rooted patterns. The deepest dangers in the spiritual life is the habit of trying to live as though we do not need God. This can happen without a person consciously rejecting God. A person may still believe in Him, attend church, pray occasionally, and consider himself a Christian, while practically living each day as though everything depends entirely upon his own strength, intelligence, plans, and abilities. This is a subtle form of self-reliance because the person may speak about trusting God while making decisions, facing temptations, handling difficulties almost entirely according to his own judgment. The modern world constantly encourages this attitude. We are told to trust ourselves, follow our desires, create our own truth, and depend upon our own abilities. Independence is often treated as the highest form of strength. But the Christian understanding of strength is different. We are creatures of God. We are dependent upon Him for our existence, our abilities, our opportunities, and ultimately for every grace necessary for our salvation. Recognizing dependence upon God is therefore not weakness. It is humility. Humility begins with truth. We must acknowledge that we are not self-sufficient. We have weaknesses that we cannot overcome through determination alone. We have temptations we cannot conquer simply by telling ourselves to be stronger. We have wounds, attachments, habits, patterns that require grace as well as effort. This does not mean that we should become passive. Grace does not eliminate human responsibility. We still have to make decisions. We still have to discipline ourselves. We still have to avoid occasions of sin, cultivate virtue, fulfill our duties, and correct our faults. We do these things while recognizing that our ability to persevere ultimately depends upon God. This distinction is extremely important. There is a difference between saying, "We'll overcome this because I am strong enough," and saying, "I will cooperate faithfully with God's grace and do what is required of me." The first places confidence primarily in the self. The second recognizes the proper order between God and the human person. Dependence upon God should therefore become practical rather than merely theoretical. Before beginning something difficult, ask for his assistance. Before entering a situation where you know you may be tempted, ask for strength. When you recognize a weakness, bring it before him instead of hiding it behind excuses. When you experience success, give thanks rather than assuming that everything was accomplished through your own ability. This habit of turning toward God throughout the day gradually changes the interior life. Instead of reacting to every difficulty with anxiety, the person learns to remember that he is not carrying everything alone. Instead of believing that every problem must be solved immediately through human control, he learns patience. Instead of becoming proud when things go well, he learns gratitude. Self-reliance can also make a person particularly vulnerable to temptation because it creates the illusion that he can manage spiritual danger through his own strength. A person may repeatedly place himself near temptation because he believes he can handle it. But humility recognizes personal weakness and therefore takes precautions. It does not presume upon strength that has not been demonstrated. Dependence upon God also requires trust during periods when circumstances do not make sense. There will be times when prayer does not seem to produce immediate answers. There will be disappointments, failures, uncertainties, and situations that cannot be controlled. Temptation during those moments is to become anxious and attempt to take complete control, but faith requires a deeper response. Do what is actually within your responsibility and trust what is beyond your control to God. This does not mean ignoring problems. It means refusing to believe that everything rests upon your shoulders. A person who lives in dependence upon God becomes more watchful, more humble, and more willing to receive correction. Recognizes that spiritual protection does not come from confidence in himself, but from remaining oriented toward God, cooperating with grace, and refusing to place his own will above divine truth. Practical question is therefore not simply whether you believe in God, but whether your daily life demonstrates that you actually depend upon him. Look at your decisions, your habits, your prayer, your response to temptation, and your reaction when things go wrong, because these reveal where your confidence is truly placed.